All right, so some of you may be here today because you have data on threatened species in Australia and you're wondering what you can do with that data. Others may be here because you want to know how you can contribute to threatened species research, but you don't have data on these species. Today, I'm going to tell you how to do that. First, I'm going to introduce you to TERN. So who is TERN and what does TERN do? I'll then move on to threatened species in Australia and highlight why long-term time series data is important for the conservation of these species. I'll then move on to the Threatened Species Index, which is one of the projects at TERN. I'll tell you what we do and what it's revealed to date and how it is used. I will then move on to the key findings of the 2023 release of one of our indices referred to as the Threatened Mammal Index. And I'll also tell you how you can contribute to threatened species research. And finally, I will talk about the future directions for the Threatened Species Index. Okay, so who is TERN? So TERN is a multi-scale continental monitoring observatory, so ecosystem observatory, sorry, that uses satellites, sensors, surveys, and tools to produce data and analytics. So we monitor the health changes in the health of Australia's land ecosystems, and these data streams and products enable Australia's world-leading research and decision-making on climate change, biodiversity, water, and soil. We provide open access data. We also provide standard methods and protocols, so services that facilitate research and education and management. We provide data infrastructure and site-based instruments and monitoring. To understand changes in our environment, we need long-term time series data. So that is time series data where you've repeated surveys at the same site over time using the same methods. We at TERN provide preservation of and open access to time series, as well as spatial data at the local, regional, and continental scale. And this coordinated and comprehensive approach by TERN enables a network of collaboration around the world and provides an effective tool for delivering outcomes for industry, researchers, and government, and so on. And all the data from TERN published by TERN and our collaborative partners can be accessed on the TERN Data Discovery Portal. So we have 50 national and international partners, 2,700 open data sets, and each year more than 6,000 unique users access our data and survey protocols. But who are these data users? So 33% of them are researchers from universities, 14% from government, and 26% are researchers from international organizations. And as I said, this enables a large network of research collaborations around the world. Some of the work that we do is on threatened species. So we provide aggregated data on threatened species and generate trends on threatened species around Australia. We also develop standard monitoring protocols that can be used for monitoring threatened species, as well as other wildlife. So Australia has incredible wildlife, but more than 2,000 of these species are currently listed as threatened, according to the Australia's Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. So we know that Australians spend a lot of time and effort and resources into threatened species monitoring, and we need to understand, given that there are a large number of threatened species and also that the environment continues to change, how these threatened species at a large scale, how they are faring over time. And we also need to know whether the conservation actions that we've implemented in Australia are having a positive impact on these threatened species trajectories and changing those trajectories. So as I said, a lot of Australians spend a lot of time and effort surveying threatened species, but unfortunately, a lot of these surveys aren't extended into long-term monitoring programs. There are a number of benefits to long-term monitoring, which I'll discuss here. So long-term monitoring is important for accurately estimating population trajectories. And from there, we're able to make reliable estimates of a species conservation status. So here I've just included an example on the growling grass frog, which is research conducted by Dr. Jeff Hurd. So if we just looked at 5 years of monitoring, this may indicate that the population is actually stable or increasing. But to look at 20 years of data or so, then we can actually see that the population is experiencing strong declines. So the difference here was long-term monitoring to understand the full picture. We need long-term monitoring to track responses of species to environmental change. So for example, bushfires, that can provide extra information there. So if you monitor them before environmental disaster and after, we can look at the impacts of those environmental disasters. Long-term monitoring is also an important tool for measuring the effectiveness of management. So those conservation actions that we implement in Australia, how are they actually altering the trajectories of these threatened species? We can also use long-term monitoring to inform predictive models, such as population viability analyses. And long-term monitoring is also a great way to engage citizen scientists. So they can be a platform to bring together like-minded people that are supportive of conservation programs that protect the species that they love and of science in general. And some examples of programs that have done a great job at this is BirdLife Australia. So we have like the Aussie Bird Count, Birds in Backyards. There's also the Bird Data app. There's projects like the Wild Orchid Watch, where people can go out and record observations of orchids at particular sites. And also Frog ID. So Australians can go out and record recordings of frogs in the area, and then Frog IDs, scientists will then listen to those calls and ID the species. And that's, again, thrown out. A great option. There are, of course, challenges with long-term monitoring. The first is no surprise, is funding. So as I said, long-term monitoring takes a lot of time and people and a lot of resources that require money. There's also, as I said, more than 2,000 species listed as threatened in Australia currently, and that means there's a lot of projects that require funding. The need for funding can also change over time, so unexpectedly as well. Maybe there's been a bushfire that has changed the population size of a particular species. There can be changes in conservation status of those species as well. And obviously also taxonomic changes as well. So it does change through time. Often long-term monitoring is driven by individuals. And often there's no good structure in place to keep those programs going when that individual can no longer keep that program going. There's also a focus on innovative, groundbreaking research. So a great example of this is new monitoring methods. While new and improved monitoring methods are great, if there's changes in methods, it can break a time series, as those abundances won't be comparable across years. There's also a focus on publishing, which is an incentive for short-term monitoring. So for example, once someone has gone out to a particular site, studied that species at that site, collect enough data for that particular research question and research article, monitoring at that site may not continue in the years to come. There are, of course, other considerations as well. So for monitoring data, there may be gaps in the long-term record. So these may be temporal gaps. So for example, annual monitoring may occur for a species every year, but this may not be possible during COVID, for example. There may be also just gaps, like, for example, if there was 2 years of data missing from a project span 15 years, we'd have more of an idea of how that population was faring compared to if that program only went for 4 years and had 2 years of missing data. So this highlights the importance of long-term monitoring programs. There can also be spatial data gaps. So there may be more data in heavily populated areas that are easy to get to, and less monitoring occurring in more remote, harder to get to regions. There may also be taxonomic data gaps. So some species may not have been studied at all or monitored at all, or the genus, for example. There's also variability in monitoring protocols, data collection, and project length. So as I said, there may be different methods used, but if it's the surveying effort that has changed, this can be accounted for or maybe accounted for by standardizing by effort. and still be used in a time series. Data collected may be signs of threatened species rather than actual sightings, so maybe scats or tracks, for example, and this can be used as a proxy for abundance. And data collected may be also random records, so such as occurrence data and more opportunistic sightings. And while this data is great, overall, we can't actually use it to build a time series. But thanks to Australia's Threatened Species Index and the many people, the many data providers that contribute data to the index and make it possible, we now have a better understanding of how threatened species are faring in Australia. So what is the Threatened Species Index? It's a database of thousands of threatened species monitoring programs from across Australia. We work with people from NGOs, government, academia, and collate their data on threatened and near threatened species in Australia. Here in the right-hand corner, we've just got an example of the type of data that we collate, which is time series data. So data is being collected at the same site using the same methods over time, over multiple years. We then use this data to create a quantitative index that measures the changes in abundance of Australia's threatened and near threatened species. And I've just included an example from the 2023 release here. So just to point out, we do release the index annually, so generally in December. So this is from the 2023 release for all the existing taxonomic groups in the index, which is birds, mammals, and plants. So here on the x-axis, we have year, and on the y-axis, we have index value. So the index starts at a value of 1 at the reference year, which in this case is 1985. Any value greater than 1 indicates an increase in abundance compared to that reference year. Any value less than 1 indicates a decrease in abundance since that reference year. So we found that in the value in 2020, the index was 0.38, and that indicates it's been a 62% decline in threatened species, threatened and near threatened species since 1985. I just wanted to mention too that we do implement a 3-year lag. So that's why this index for 2023 only included data up to 2020. So just a bit more on the steps that we go through each year to create this index. So we start each year by reaching out to data providers to get updated data sets for particular species, or we reach out to potential data providers to see if they can submit entirely new data sets that we haven't yet received. We store this data in a raw database, which is confidential and secure. This data is then cleaned and processed, and it's aggregated temporally and spatially to create time series data. Oh, and I should mention too that we I've just included here that you can use the IUCN Red List logo as it's threatened or near threatened according to the EPBC Act or IUCN Red List of threatened species. All right, so this time series data is then aggregated in a database with the sensitive information removed, such as locations. And so this is open access. So you can go online and actually see this information yourself. You can download the time series data. And so we want to be as transparent as possible and ensure faith in the trends that we're generating, the trend estimates. And so for this reason that we make it open access. We then use the Living Planet methodology to create the trend estimates, or generate the trend estimates, I should say. And then these trends that are produced are assessed for the quality of those trends before being uploaded to our website at the end of each year. So what are the data requirements for the Threatened Species Index? So we refer to these as the 3 Ds: data type, dependability, and duration. So the data is species abundance or data on a proxy of abundance. The abundance needs to be measured, or proxy of abundance needs to be measured at the same site using the same method and measured over at least 2 years. So just a brief history of the Threatened Species Index. So it started as the Threatened Bird Index at the National Environmental Science Program Threatened Species Recovery Hub in collaboration with BirdLife Australia. It was led by this amazing team here. And while it was at the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, they also went on to build a Threatened Mammal Index and also a Threatened Plant Index. At the end of the TSR hub, it then transitioned to TERN. And in 2022, we updated our data sets or data that we had for all existing groups, so mammals, plants, and birds. In 2023, we also completed a major update to the threatened bird index. This year, we aim to release a pilot of Australia's first threatened frog index, as well as updating our existing groups, so plants, mammals, and birds. So very exciting stuff. So where are we at today with the Threatened Species Index? So we've been creating or building this database since 2016. We have data on 286 taxa across 3 major taxonomic groups. The data comes from 230 data sources, and we have just over 22,000 time series. And that's with data from over 13,000 monitoring sites. As you can see here in this map, we have data from every state and territory, but there is a spatial bias towards the more populated areas in the Southeast Australia. So data is collected across Australia using a variety of methods that varies across taxonomic groups and sites. I've just included some of the logos for our collaborating partners here. As I said, we have many collaborating partners. It takes an entire community to make this index possible. So I've just included some of those there, and also the data providers to break it down a bit further. So many of the data providers for the index in 2023, many of the data sources came from government. We also have data from NGOs and academia. So how is the Threatened Species Index used? So it has become Australia's objective measure of change in threatened species and near threatened species through time. It was included in the latest State of the Environment report. Australia's Treasury Department released its Measuring What Matters framework, and it included the Threatened Species Index as its key biological diversity indicator. It's also been adopted by the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, who's been a major partner of the index. The index has been incorporated into their corporate reporting as a way for the department to assess the effectiveness of their policies and conservation actions. So earlier I showed you that the 2023 release of the index showed that there'd been a 62% decline overall. Just breaking it a bit further down here into the different taxonomic groups, so plants, mammals, and birds. So we found that there, and just to point out that on the y-axis here, instead of the index value, we have the relative abundance as a percentage. So with the reference year of 1985 as well, we found that there was a 72% decline in average of threatened and near threatened plants since 1985. For mammals, it was a 52% decline, and for birds, a 60% decline in average since 1985. I'm just going to walk you through now one of the indices, part of the Threatened Species Index, which we refer to as the Threatened Mammal Index, and what we found in the 2023 release. So as I said, we showed that there was a 52% decline in the average decline in abundance of threatened and non-threatened, near threatened species since 1985. I'm just going to point out here that we do have the index value once again on the y-axis. So this grey cloud here is our 95% confidence intervals, and as it is solid, it represents interspecific variation. And so on our website, if you have a look at our trends, if you see that this line here, the trend was dashed, that would indicate that it was based on a single species. So for the mammals, we had data on 78 threatened and near threatened mammals, and also just over 2,200 time series. And this data came from 98 data sources. I'm just going to take you through as well a little bit later, also some of the gaps that we have in this mammal index, so spatial, temporal, and taxonomic gaps. So one thing you can do also on the visualizer tool online is also break it down into states and territories, as I've done here. So looking at the states and territories now with a reference year of 2000. So we see that there was a 56% decline in abundance since the year 2000. Victoria also had a 56% decline. Queensland had a 64% decline. Northern Territory was a 76% decline. South Australia was a 77% increase since 2000. Tasmania was a 44% increase since 2000. And Western Australia had a 28% decline in the abundance of threatened and near threatened mammals since 2000. Now, because we do also collect information on whether a site and or species being monitored were also being actively managed for conservation, we can filter for this information and generate trends, as I've done here. So when we look at unmanaged sites, so we said there's a much greater decline in abundance with 61% since the reference year of 1995. When we look at managed sites, we see it's less, so the decline is 29% since the same reference year of 1995. So diving a bit deeper now into the data that went into the Threatened Mammal Index in 2023. And so we can see here that there is variation in the sampling intensity across Australia. We again do have data for all states and territories for the Mammal Index. We can see here that high sampling intensity is indicated in pink and low sampling intensity is indicated in blue. So we do again have, as we expected, a spatial bias towards the more populated areas in the southeast, but we do have areas of more intense sampling as well in southeast Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and also Northern Territory. Looking at the mammalian taxa, so our index included data for 58 species or mammal species listed on the EPBC Act, and also 12 species that are listed as national priority species, and that's of January 2024. And that included these species here that were listed as priority species, so koala, Australian sea lion, and numbat. Looking into the time series and number of taxa now, so we can see that the mammal monitoring in Australia took off in the 1990s. For our index, we found that there was the greatest number of taxa and time series between 2010 and 2015. We do actually see that there is a drop off after that point, so since 2015, and this is because data does take a while to come through to us. Maybe reasons for this include data processing, time to allow for data processing, competing commitments, and also people maybe waiting to publish that research as well. And that's another reason why we have a 3-year lag. So the index this year for 2024 will include data up to 2021. When we look at the length of monitoring programs for mammals in Australia, we find that they are mostly short term. So we can look at the time series length. And so we actually see that the monitoring program length that had the greatest number of monitoring programs was 2 years, just over 400 monitoring programs. But because there are a number of longer term monitoring programs as well, the average is nearly 10 years. When we look at time series sample years and also time series completeness, so the time series completeness is a proportional measure of the number of years throughout the entire time series that contains samples. So for example, if the time series completeness had a value of 1, that would indicate that all of those samples within the length of the time series were sampled. And we can see that we have an average of 5.3 for the time series sample years, and also the time series completeness, 0.75. And this indicates that we have some temporal data gaps in this index. So some species may not need to be monitored every year, but for those that do, and we have these data gaps, this may indicate that we don't have the full picture. We don't truly understand the trajectories of these species. So long-term monitoring is important. Time series sampling evenness. So this is where if we have a low number, it indicates that even if there are data gaps in that time series, we are missing data in some of those years, that those gaps are evenly distributed. And we can see here that we have a low value of 1.1. This is not surprising, as many of the monitoring programs went for 2 years. But there is considerable variation. Yes. So as I've demonstrated, we do have a lot of data in the Threatened Species Index and including the Threatened Mammal Index, but there are temporal, spatial, and taxonomic data gaps. We, of course, are always trying to collect more and more data, and we look forward to filling those gaps. So where to next for the Threatened Species Index? So we aim to add additional taxonomic groups, so also on threatened reptiles and invertebrates in the coming years. We also hope to understand how we can use alternative data types. So, for example, the Threatened Species Index doesn't have much data from camera trapping and acoustics. So projects like the Australian Acoustic Observatory and Wildlife Observatory of Australia, which are supported and enabled by TERN, will play a key role for us tapping those data sources or those alternative data types. We also hope to better understand how we can use occurrence data, so that data that is and the more opportunistic data. And we also hope to, in the years to come, we could also apply what we've built with the Threatened Species Index and apply this to other elements of biodiversity. And this could include the Invasive Species Index. It could also include the Threatened Ecosystem Index. And then we could potentially tie that all together. So what we know from the Threatened Species Index as well into an overall biodiversity index. So how can you help? So spread the word and get involved. If you have threatened species data or near threatened species data, please reach out to us. If you know someone who does, please tell them about the Threatened Species Index. We always want more data. And also that you can get involved with citizen science programs as well, as I mentioned before. And BirdLife Australia does have their Aussie bird count coming up from the 14th to the 20th of October. And just thank you to the following organizations. And these are some of the collaborating partners for the Threatened Species Index, not all of them, but some of them. And thank you to all of our collaborating partners. Just some references. And if you'd like to know more, please check out our training resources, the TSX training resources. I've got a QR link here. And QR code, I should say. And we've got the QR code for the TSX visualizer tool. So you could be able to see some of the trends that I generated today, and filter for different states, territories, different functional groups, and then you can download data as well. So please do check that out. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions.